I'm Samuel Sennett, Assistant Professor. We're going to talk about ethics in educational research. Here's a bit of an overview of what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about ethical considerations. We're going to talk about that educational researchers must adhere to ethical considerations set forth by their IRBs, set forth by the various fields and disciplines that they study inside of. So, we're going to talk about some of these categories of ethical issues: protection from harm, voluntary and informed participation and consent, right to privacy, as well as honesty with professional colleagues. Let's dive in. Protection from harm. So you must not harm people, right? This is protecting people from unnecessary or physical, psychological harm. And the most concern lately has been with psychological harm. It just seems unlikely that there would be physical harm introduced for most research studies. And you want to be thinking about vulnerable populations. Now, examples of vulnerable populations, these are children, people with disabilities. Happens to be a lot of the people that we're focused on in this course sequence in your work. So informed participation is often thought of as informed consent. And you can think about this as that signature page where it describes what the participant will do, and you're going to do this in your work. You'll have an informed consent sheet, and then for people who are under 18 uh, that can provide consent, they can also do that written. But people who can't necessarily understand the form or sign their name and be able to read that themselves, you can get assent, which is basically a verbal agreement or some sort of agreement. Or, also, sometimes with children, just that they participate in the activity, that's their assent. Research is voluntary, and you have to have a good disclosure that leads to this state of being informed. And you can see in the text has some good examples. Those little pull-out figures 4.1 and 4.2 showed informed consent forms. So good thing to take a quick look at. Yours will be customized for your research, of course, based on the PSU templates. Right to privacy. Most research you're going to get as anonymous and confidential as possible. Anonymity, this is where identities are kept hidden from the researcher. Confidentiality, this is where researchers know who the people are, but they don't share that outside the study. Sometimes these things are used synonymously, but they're really not the same. Confidentiality is kind of the minimal expected standard. Sometimes you have anonymous surveys where there's just coded identifiers. You have no idea who these people are. So here's another aspect of ethics that's gotten into the news over the last few years: honesty in reporting. We have an ethical obligation to report the results in complete, honest manner. And you don't want to intentionally mislead others. Data, of course, should not be fabricated, and conclusions should not be manipulated. Now, here's why this is important. You may feel pressure to get through your research study, or someone who's a researcher might want to get good impact or effect, but it doesn't do anyone any good. It's misleading, and it doesn't help people know the right way to go. And that's the whole point of research, is to really understand what worked and what didn't. If you start sending people down the wrong paths, that's just hurting the field and not helping it. So we can talk a lot about that. We could look at some examples from the news, but I really think that you all probably get this, especially as you're out there, most of you in real classrooms. You're hungry to know what's going to work, get tips, learn vicariously from researchers so you can bring those practices into your classroom. So you get that. So, when you think about qualitative and quantitative, you're going to see some differences in the way the studies work with relation to ethics. And so, with specifically applying to IRB boards, the emergent nature is what we call it sometimes in qualitative designs. This is going to make it difficult to put in all of your methodologies. You may have your guiding research questions, but you, especially with some of these grounded theory models, you're going to be evolving your study from the data that you're collecting. And so, with qualitative, you also might need to focus on really connecting with your participants and being able to be sensitive. So, it's important to be where you're at. Describe it as a qualitative study that's going to set the IRB reviewers, the ethics board reviewers, in that mindset, and they're going to let you use your methodology. You'll still have to have protections, but where if you have a quantitative study, they're going to make you drill down to your questions and your methods. And so IRBs, this is institutional review boards. We have one here at Portland State. These are the folks that review research studies and approve them as having minimal protections, or the right protections for human subjects, and they're going to protect those participants. They're not saying, "Hey, you got a great study here, knock it out of the park, friend." It's really about protecting the participants. And so reviews occur when you're proposing the research, and they have to occur prior to formal data collection. And you get this approved, and then if you change something substantial, you need to submit a revision. So there's typically three types of reviews. One is exempt from review. If this study doesn't really involve human participants, it can often be exempt. You can get expedited. This is where their typical educational practices. Almost all the research I've done has been expedited. A couple have been exempt. This is where their typical practices, participants aren't in really any noticeable risk categories. But also there's full board review. This is where if more risk is involved or data collection is from a population who is vulnerable, especially folks, say, who are incarcerated, or if you're involving taking any any physical samples, medical samples from people, this is going to get full board review. So here are a few steps to think about with the IRB process. You're going to want to familiarize yourself with our IRB procedures. And this is just a good thing to skim the website, take a look. You can determine what information will be needed. Now, your project faculty member is going to help you with this. You're not going to be alone in this. But you're going to want to really be able to step up and work together with that faculty member. So it's also important to take a look at this stuff now, because it'll help you think about what you're going to have to document for data collection instrumentation, and just be thinking about your informed consent, and you'll develop those tools, informed consent, data collection, all of your study materials, and then you'll complete and submit an IRB application with signatures. You'll paste in your city research training, and some folks do IRB. This is required for National Institutes of Health research, so I'm actively applying for NIH research myself and with some colleagues. So this is a fantastic training to do if you really are very interested in this topic. You've done the city, I highly recommend jumping in and doing the NIH training if you think you might collaborate with an NIH researcher or do some NIH research of your own. You're going to want to do this. And so for you, you have to do the city training. Again, this is a great resource. You'll learn a lot from it. It's historical. If you're into history, you're going to learn a lot about the unfolding of how the current state of affairs has occurred. And so get it done. It's going to take a little while, especially because you're learning this content fresh. So dive in, get it done, and print out your certificate and put it in the Dropbox. Good luck.